doing things a little different. So I'm one of the organizers. This is Jeff Mann. You work for Tenable. Tenable has been supporting B-Sides for many years. And if you've been to any of the sessions I've narrated before, Tenable is a very good sponsor. And when you think about security, you should think about Tenable and Jeff Mann. Right? Jeff has 30 years experience, and since this is a 30-minute presentation, I'm going to turn it over to you and get started. Go for the artwork.
Ready, set, go. Thanks, B-Sides San Francisco, for letting me speak here today. And I hope it's not just because Tenable's a sponsor.
No,
it's not. Great. So, Jeff Mann is my name. Security is my game. I've been in the industry probably about 34 years, really, if you add it all up. That's what I used to look like, and you can't hardly see it. But I used to have hair, and it used to be long. And that was my passport photo. If you're interested afterwards in speaking to me, getting in touch with me, I can certainly share my contact information since it's mostly washed out, but it's also up there at Mr. Jeff Mann on Twitter. Let me jump into this. The art of the Jedi mind trick. First, I'm going to explain to you, hopefully in very short order, why I consider myself a Jedi master. Talk about the problem that I'm discussing, what I think's missing, next steps, and hopefully we'll have time for some Q&A. So we're going to jump right into it. A long time ago, I saw the original Star Wars in the theaters when I was in junior high. Anybody with me? The bartender and a couple more. Before they called it Episode 4, it was just Star Wars. I'm going to throw this up here and risk having stones thrown at me. I began my official career at that place. And I started out there as a cryptanalyst, and I moved on years later into information security analyst work, which got me into penetration testing back in the early days, back in the mid-90s. When I was getting involved in cryptography, this is the kind of stuff that I worked with. You can't tell what it is. That's a one-time pad. Cryptography was done on paper back in those days, and we broke it with graph paper and colored pencils. But the computer came along and we started automating things in terms of cryptography, and we started taking things like one-time pads and putting them into computer programs and using IBM PCs before they were networked, so there was a little bit better level security on them. To put things in context, everybody know what that is? Yeah. When I started working at NSA, it was still a secret that we had broken the encryption of the Enigma machine. That wasn't made public until the late 80s. Why was it still a secret? Because there were still some countries that were using it. Think about it. Anyway, I left the NSA in about 1996, and this is not a talk about me. I'm just giving the context of why I'm a Jedi Master. I went out into the commercial sector and started out doing pen testing, which turned out to be a lot of vulnerability assessment. And it was the early days we were trying to convince companies why they needed to have a firewall if they were going to be on the internet and things like that. And really it was the beginning of developing any type of sense of having a security program, having any kind of policies, any kind of concept of what they were trying to accomplish with security. So there was a lot of education, security program development, architecture development, and things like that. Somewhere along the line, I fell into PCI. I call it PCI Purgatory. I ended up being a QSA for 10 years, and luckily I was released from PCI work. I was hired by Tenable about 2.5 years ago, brought on as their PCI subject matter expert. I do security as well because I had 20 years of experience before I got into PCI work. Which brings me up to today. I went around last year, spoke at several different conferences, user events, partner events, things like that for Tenable, and I gave a talk called The State of Information Security Today. Are we getting any better? One of the things I observed as I was going to all sorts of different conferences, and I won't name them, it doesn't matter, but I heard a lot of really smart people giving a lot of really interesting, fascinating talks. But if you've noticed in the last couple years, there's a lot of breaches reported in the news. There's a lot of fraud happening. There was a guy who just gave a fraud talk a little while ago. The bad guys have figured out how to monetize, breaking into things and compromising data. And coming from the PCI background, there were so many retail breaches in the last couple of years, point of sale malware and things like that. I was doing some soul searching. I'm like, gee, are we doing any better as an industry when, things are bad, breaches are still happening, and you find out that the causes are, default settings, default passwords never being changed, weak passwords. And I'm like, gosh, that's how I was breaking into stuff 20 years ago. So, gave this talk about what's wrong with the industry and how we can change it, but also heard a lot of people talking about problems. And I thought to myself, maybe part of the problem is us. Maybe we're not good at communicating. Maybe we're having a hard time getting the point across because, for various reasons. Maybe we're not practiced at communicating. Maybe we don't get the opportunity to stand up in front of a group very often. Maybe we're not going in front of the board of directors very often, or even our bosses, or the staff meetings or whatever. So this is where I started having this idea. Maybe I need to talk about some of the things that I know I've done for many years, but I don't even really know what the techniques are that I'm doing. So I tried to figure out, okay, what is it that I do? Because I know how to go into a company, sit down with a group of people, whether they're executives or whether they're technologists, whether they're administrators, management, techie, and I can pretty fairly often get a good rapport going with them. Not always. There's certainly hostile environments that I go into or have gone into, but I found that I was pretty good at getting the point across, teaching security concepts, getting my customers to a point of understanding. They didn't always do what I thought they needed to do, but I could at least make them more educated and give them so that they had an informed decision, risk-based decision when they were deciding not to do what I thought that they needed to do. Or maybe we found a compromise somewhere along the line. So, this is just in the last year or two, some of the big companies, and like I said, this is kind of what I've been worried about. But this is a meme that was out on the Twitters about in the last week or so. Has anybody seen this? Take a second to read it. I don't read slides to people. If you read this, you can take a lot of things away from it, and certainly there's truth in this, but when I read this, I thought, gee, this is sort of encapsulating what I'm seeing as I go out into the community, the hacker security community, these different conferences. Sometimes we know what the answer is, and we know what needs to be done, but if we can't communicate that, I think we're just as much responsible. And so, that's my easing into this message of how do we do better at communicating. So this is going to be lightning fast. Some of the things, the techniques, the methodologies that I use for communicating over the years as I'm approaching customers, as I'm talking to groups and things like that. Very first thing, and some of these things you've probably heard before because I've even heard talks also on this topic in the last year or two. Know your audience. When I got started in the pen testing business 20 years ago, we didn't have Google. Didn't mean there weren't search engines out there. I would try to figure out if I was going into a company, what type of company was it? Who are the management? Who are the people I'm going to meet? Find out what their background is. What are their likes and their interests? And that was, there was a couple different reasons. Back then it was more tactical because, like, if they loved Corvettes, that'd be the first password I'd try when I was trying to hack their account. But also, it gives you the ability to find out where they're coming from. So, just as an example, by show of hands, and there's no right or wrong answer, nobody's going to be mad at you or anything, but in terms of the best hacker movie that's out there these days, who thinks it's Black Hat? Raise your hand. I shamed you by starting with that one. Enemy of the State? Got one. War Games. Got a few more no's. The bottom right is Swordfish. Anyone? Not just because of Halle Berry, but for the hacking elements? Okay, Firewall? Hackers. Got a few. I actually watched Hackers on Netflix just a couple nights ago, and it was a humorous look down memory lane. Sneakers. Yeah. I think the consensus in this audience is it's sort of close between Sneakers and War Games. Enemy of the State, by the way, is kind of my favorite because it's about where I used to work, and it's fun to watch fictional movies about NSA because they're only guessing what it's really like there. There's a scene in Enemy of the State where the black limousine with the bad guy deputy director, who I actually used to work for, drives into the glass cubicle building down this ramp. And I always chuckle because that's actually the loading dock where they used to bring the food trucks in for the cafeteria. That's a secret about NSA that you never knew. But anyway, when you ask questions like this of an audience or of a group, or you get a sense of, just in the responses, what type of person they are. Everybody hates Black Hat. What do you take away from that as information? The difference between war games and sneakers. Sneakers is what kind of introduced social engineering. A little bit in war games, but sneakers is the big one. So everybody that likes sneakers the best, I'm thinking you guys probably love social engineering. That's a technique. I don't know the name of it, but that's a technique. Here's the biggest one. You go in and you listen. I used to go into companies and just ask, what problem are you trying to solve? And I'd listen to them talk. Usually they had no clue. And even to this day, very often companies don't really know what they're trying to get to, what their objective, what their goal is by, I've got to do security. I know I've got to meet this compliance standard. This is this PCI thing. Just having a conversation about what is it you're trying to protect, listening to them articulate it, hearing that is a clue of how to you log that, and then you use that as a technique later on when you're trying to describe the solutions. So listening is an important thing. Anybody tell what movie that is? This is sort of a movie themed talk. This Poppins. Field of Dreams. Very good. I believe very strongly, and I've said for years that I'm bilingual. I'm able to talk tech talk with the techies, but I've also been able to talk non-technically to the non-technical folks who are usually the decision makers in most organizations. And the best analogy I can use on why you need to learn to speak their language is, have you ever seen somebody, and maybe you've done it yourself, tried to talk to either a deaf person or somebody that speaks a foreign language? We tend to talk slowly and very loudly. And I suggest to you, if you don't hear me or speak the language, that doesn't help a bit. I don't care how slow you talk to me. If I don't speak your language, I'm not going to understand a word you're saying. It's more important to speak the language of the customer. I used to get this a lot with PCI work because I used to get called an auditor all the time. And I would say, I'm not an auditor, I'm an assessor. The PCI compliance process is an assessment, not an audit. But, at the end of the day, once I explained that to the customer, if they wanted to call me an auditor, I was an auditor. I wasn't going to argue with them. It's very good, very important sometimes to break it down, what you're trying to convey in terms of a technical issue or what you're trying to get them to in terms of an objective, to tell stories, to come up with analogies. My wife is really good at this. I'm not, but I try. What I have found over the years is you have to be very careful in the analogies you use. I'm a white male. I tend to like to use sports analogies. I love football. I love baseball, basketball. Not everybody else does. So sports analogies don't often work. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I've been to foreign countries where I find myself using colloquialisms and phrases that are very familiar in the English language or the region in which I live. And as I'm saying it, I realize this person from wherever I am has no idea what I'm talking about because they've never heard this phrase before. And of course, they can have phrases too that don't mean anything to us Americans. This is a toughie. Movie? Big Fish. Good job. If you're missing the elliptic curve talk, here's my one crypto slide. I am a cryptanalyst by trade. I am primarily a manual cryptanalyst. I've designed codes, I've broken codes, and I can talk the elliptic curve type talk. But for most people, when you start talking elliptic curves and large random numbers and pseudo-random and this, that, and the other, a lot of times it goes over people's heads. So I just break it down to, there's something that you have that's readable text. You have to do some kind of fancy math stuff combined with some kind of random, which is called a key, and that produces that code. That usually explains it for most people. And the details, if you need to go into them, you can go into them. But for the most part, breaking it down gets the point across. Because many of you probably work for companies where there's business decisions that have to be made based on things like profitability and margin and revenue and things like that, it's important to learn a little bit about the business. This should be an easy one. Movie. Office Space, yes. I'm a people person. Wow, there's no way you're going to guess that movie. Would it help if I told you that's Samuel L. Jackson? No, well, that's close. It's a good guess. Don't assume that people are understanding what you're telling them the first time. Ask, when you're explaining something to somebody, ask them, what did you just hear me say? Very often, I found out they had no clue what I was saying. So you have to regroup and try again. And again, don't say the same thing over again. Try a different approach. Try a different analogy. The first one didn't work. Try something different. The clue is the assumption. Don't assume anything. This is the long kiss goodnight. The slides will be up on the website later. You can see what it looked like. This was really important, especially when we were coming in doing vulnerability assessments to companies, or if you're giving them a gap assessment on this is how bad things truly are. It's a psychological thing, and I learned this from my parents in my childhood. Don't start with the bad. Give some people some props. Well, your website has some real pretty colors. I like the way it's organized. But you've got a few, we found a few issues with cross-site scripting, and, explain what that means and why it's bad. And then get down to and by the way, there was a default password there, and that caused us to, rape and pillage and overrun your entire environment. But, work into it. I learned this from my childhood, as I said, because I never got straight A's as a child. And the closest I got one time, I came home with like 6 A's and a B. And the first thing my dad says was, "Why'd you get a B in that course?" So I'm scarred from that, but I've tried to take that as a life lesson into my consulting career. That's a real broad, quick overview of techniques, but the fundamentals there are good communication skills is really what we're talking about, and having the opportunity to practice them. How do we move on? Who's ready for the red pill? Who wants the blue pill? And everybody knows what this movie is? The Matrix. Spaceballs. You failed the class. The message here is, don't give up. You've got to keep trying, and even though common sense might tell you to walk away, those people are too stupid to ever understand. You got to keep going. And in fact, I kind of think of the challenge of going into an environment where I need to convey and educate and teach and persuade an audience, a group, a company. I consider it to be more of a puzzle than a game. Security very often is described as a game, but when you think of it as a puzzle, there's a solution somewhere in there. And very often there's more than one solution. So keep that as a frame of reference and keep going. And understand that sometimes, especially if you're in a monolithic company, a large company that's been set in their ways, or they think that they've got limited budget and, they're stretched thin and they can't invest one more thing in one more, cool gee whiz thing that you want them to do. Keep in mind that it takes time. So the analogy here is it takes time to steer the Titanic from, and this is the movie Titanic. So, summarize. Again, these are good communication skills. The art of the Jedi mind trick, I believe, if you have information that you need to convey to another person, to another group, you need to break it down in such a way that they understand, because security is really reasonable at the end of the day in most cases, and logical arguments, logical rationale, reasoning can be given to people, and they should be able to draw the same logical conclusion that you have without the emotion, without the excitement, without the pizzazz and the technical details. Just break it down into language that they can understand. Get a lot of feedback from them in terms of listening to them and hearing, what their challenges are and being able to modify the solution. My favorite thing was to always offer 3 solutions, and there was the, do nothing approach, or the bare minimum. There was the ultra high level, you have all the money and the time and the resources in the world, you could do this, or there's some middle ground. And of course, where I wanted them was in the middle ground. They'd obviously rule out the one end, they'd obviously rule out the higher end, and then we talk about that middle ground. And there was usually some negotiation there as well, but when they walked away, they felt like they'd made an informed decision. I felt better because I felt that they'd made an informed decision. They weren't blindly walking off, exposing themselves. They knew what the risks were, but it was a calculated risk. It was a risk that they were willing to take on, and that also gave them direction for what they needed to do in terms of security moving forward, which was maybe increased monitoring, increased awareness. If you've closed 9 out of 10 holes, but you can't close that 10th hole, watch it really carefully to make sure nothing's coming through that hole at the end of the day. Movie? Very good. Any questions? Comments? Pushback? Feedback? Yes?
When I was thinking about your talk, some of it was like, you were going in as a consultant to talk to CEO types versus my reality, which is I'm in a big company.
Right.
Everybody knows me. Everybody runs away from me already. So, if you had special advice on that side.
Go to get a new job where they don't know you yet. No, I realize that's a limitation because my experience has been, I get to come in as the consultant, the expert, and I used to joke with, it was actually a technique I used to use to win over the security guys, the IT guys. I'd say, hey guys, what do you need? Especially for the PCI, because you know your environment better. You know what you need. If I slap PCI on it, guess what? You'll get it, and I'll be your friend. So I used to joke that I had this magic cape that I could just get things. I'm experiencing the challenges of working for a company now, trying to educate and shift them into a different directions, and it is a lot harder. I think, and I've experienced the looks of, oh, here he comes again, and they turn the other way. I think it's more slow, more methodical. You have to be more patient and kind of pick your battles and try to make small wins. And again, I think it's more important than ever to try to give the information in such a way where that your management can kind of make the logical conclusion and try not to say, and I saw this in an email just a couple of days ago within Tenable, they said it very in a flowery manner, but it was basically, I told you so. Try not to do that. There's a question down here? It was a never mind? I answer questions before they're even asked. That is the art of the Jedi mind trick. See. If you're really super interested, this is really a presentation that is trying to pique your interest. I'm going to be at Circle CityCon in June giving a training course where we explore some of these things that I've talked about in the last 15, 20 minutes, but try to actually give you guys the opportunity to practice them, the opportunity to speak, the opportunity to interact, which I think sometimes we don't get, and I'm hoping, it's a theory, that that'll help all of us do better in our jobs. Yes? All of them. I mean, really, sometimes it's the more basic concepts, like why should everybody in the company have a strong password and change it and not use the same password that they're using on 20 accounts at home? Those are the basics that companies are still falling down over. So I feel like we haven't tackled the fundamentals yet. So I'd start there. Yes, sir.
This is more from your experience. What's been your success rate or failure rate discussing quantitative versus qualitative risk management?
Wow. 100% failure. No, probably 50-50. But again, some organizations want the quantitative. Some organizations want the qualitative. To me, it's more the trick of knowing what they want to hear and knowing what they're going to respond to. What's the triggers? And that to me, it takes practice, and it's learning how to pick up on the cues, which again I think it's a technique that I've learned that I hope I've tried to identify them. But there's probably more out there as well. Yes?
I find if I put it just in terms of how can I best support the business achieve their goals, they're much more receptive than we either do this or we're dead.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, it's hard to push security as, this is a way to increase profit, which is what they want to hear, or cut expenses, which is what they want to hear. But to have a responsible, meaningful, reasonable message for this is why it's a necessary investment, and this is, without doing too much FUD, this is the bad that could happen. But, again, there's a balance in there. So to me, it's all being reactionary. Yes?
How would you deal with actively hostile
Management?
Actively hostile.
Actively hostile management. Probably regroup and just try to find a sympathetic ear somewhere else in management and sort of backdoor them. Build allies, build enough people that are getting the picture, and find the influencers. I used to walk into companies and try to find out who was the person in charge. Very often the person really ran the organization was not the boss, it was the boss's admin. So I would win her over, him or her over. Sorry, I don't mean to be sexist. And it was often a woman, frankly. But, they're the ones that had the real power. Anyway, do I have that long, or are we done? We're done. Sorry. Thank you very much, everyone.